Think you're eating enough protein? Guess what? Your muscle building switch is probably stuck off, which most meals never hit the leucine threshold. Your body needs to keep muscle, stay strong, and fight off insulin resistance. Let me show you how to fix it before it's too late. Alright, hey everyone, I'm Marc Bates. I'm a metabolic health coach. This is part of my question and answer series. The protein mistake that keeps you weak and skinny fat. Yes, that is actually a term. We'll explain it here. Leucine threshold explained. Alright, let's get to the question. That leucine threshold you mentioned, 2.5 to 3 grams to trigger muscle protein synthesis, is fascinating. Most people have no idea they need to hit specific amino acid targets at each meal. What happens metabolically when someone consistently falls short of that leucine threshold, especially if they're following conventional balanced nutritional advice? Well, wow, that's a big one because, yeah, consistently missing that leucine threshold at meals has real metabolic consequences, especially as you age. It's one of the salient drivers of sarcopenia, age-related muscle loss, and metabolic decline that mainstream nutrition advice largely ignores. Here's what happens step by step. So let's get into it. First, you have a sub-threshold leucine, right? At most, or if not all, your meals. This leads to weak or no anabolic switch. Okay, so leucine is the key trigger for activating mTOR1, the cellular pathway that initiates muscle protein synthesis, MPS. At around 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine per meal, that's eating about 25 to 30 grams of high quality protein at each meal, right? That's animal protein. The mTOR switch flips fully on, allowing your muscles to build or repair tissue. When you eat below that threshold, let's say for example you're eating 10 to 15 grams of protein, but that protein is from cereal, toast, and beans, the switch barely flickers or stays off, meaning you burn amino acids for energy or glucose production rather than using them to build muscle, right? So what you end up with is a chronic anabolic resistance. Over time, low leucine meals train your body to stay in a muscle maintenance deficit, especially if you're older, right, or insulin resistant, because aging increases anabolic resistance. You need more leucine to stimulate the same MPS response compared to younger adults. And if your meals never reach threshold, you effectively never give your muscle tissue the stimulus to grow or even maintain itself. So what do you get? Net muscle protein breakdown. Muscle is constantly undergoing turnover, right, all the time. Breakdown, catabolism, versus synthesis, anabolism. If synthesis is never fully triggered, breakdown outpaces synthesis, leading to gradual muscle loss, even if total daily protein grams look adequate on paper. This accelerates sarcopenia, reducing strength, mobility, and metabolic health, and can bring it on even sooner, right? All right, loss of metabolic reserve and insulin sensitivity. So muscle is the largest glucose sink in the body and the key site for mitochondrial energy production. Less muscle equals less glycogen storage, which means you get poor glucose clearance when you do eat some glucose, and higher circulating insulin levels. Okay? Over time, this contributes to insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes risk, and reduced metabolic flexibility, even if you're not visibly frail yet. Okay? Then you get what's called into the skinny fat phenotype. I told you to explain this. People following conventional low protein, high carb, balanced diets often lose lean mass and retain fat mass, especially during calorie restriction. Without sufficient leucine at each meal, weight loss equals muscle loss, not just fat loss. This results in lower basal metabolic rate and a greater fat regain when normal eating resumes. This is the old dieting roller coaster we've all heard about or been on ourselves, right? Where you lose easily, and then all of a sudden you stop losing and you start gaining it all back, and it comes back even faster than you lost it, right? Then you have to work real hard to lose it again, and you go over the hill, and it all comes back even faster, and more of it comes back. This is the skinny fat phenotype. Okay? You also get a blunted response to exercise. Hey, I go to the gym every day, Mark. I'm not concerned about this. Okay. Resistance training increases the demand for amino acids, but exercise alone cannot overcome a leucine deficit. If your post-workout meal doesn't hit the leucine threshold, the exercise signal fizzles, muscle is primed to grow but lacks the trigger, and gains in strength and lean tissue are limited even with hard training. So these vegan bodybuilders and athletes, I'm really questioning how long they can keep that up. Okay? Just because of the way muscles build. Okay, bottom line. Hitting leucine thresholds 3 times per day is like turning on the muscle preservation switch every 4 to 5 hours. Right? Conventional balanced meals, toast and jam for breakfast, sandwich for lunch, pasta for dinner, never reach that threshold, leaving you in a constant state of low-grade muscle catabolism despite meeting daily protein RDAs. Over decades, this explains why lean mass declines sharply with age, driving frailty, slower metabolism, higher diabetes risk, and poor aging outcomes. All right? So, if you have any questions or any comments, put them in the appropriate section. Thanks for watching here. We are a community here. I'm here to try to answer your questions. If there's something I'm not covering the way you want, as much as you want, or that you have an idea for something you would like to know more about, leave me some clues in the guidelines. I mean, in comments, and I'm more than happy to add it to my publishing schedule as fast as possible. All right? And as always, if you haven't done so, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with friends. You're going to help a lot of people, and it helps the channel a great deal. So thank you.